It's indeed an honor and a pleasure to be here on this platform. In our chat on arrhythmias in the ICU and the ways of managing them, our chief objectives would be the recognition of abnormal ECG patterns, looking at the contribution of non-cardiac factors to ECG abnormalities, appropriate management of these changes, and an overview of the antiarrhythmic drugs that are commonly used in the ICU. The eye only sees what the mind is prepared to comprehend. So it's very important for us, especially in the CCU and the ICU, to have an understanding of the general critical condition of the patient and factors that can cause sudden deterioration. When we are talking about ECG evaluation and arrhythmia detection, it's very critical that we have a systematic approach to ECG recording. The recording is as important as the interpretation. Very important to ensure that a good ECG is taken, which requires a proper site preparation before the leads are placed. And very critically, in an important thing is the fact that you need to ensure that the leads are correctly placed, especially in critical situations when there is a lot of stress. If the monitor shows an abnormality, it's very important to not diagnose it off the monitor, but actually take a 12-lead ECG at that point. Filtering settings for the monitors as well as a 12-lead ECG are different, and quite often ischemia can be missed on the monitor if that is the only thing that is being used to detect it. It's important while taking a 12-lead ECG to minimize the drift of the baseline. If the patient is on a ventilator, it's important to take it on the apneic phase. Otherwise, if the patient is conscious and able to follow orders, holding the breath is important. Additional noise from the surrounding electronic devices, electromagnetic interference, can also cause abnormalities in the ECG recording, and they need to be troubleshot. When the ECG is finally in our hands, it's important to look at all the components of the ECG and not just look at the rhythm or the ST segment. We need to see whether there is a proper P wave, a QRS, and a T wave. Is there a 1:1 relationship between them? Whether there is more A's or more V's. The PR is constant, the QT is normal, and if it is abnormal, is there a contributing factor? With this initial approach, let's look at a few ECGs and possible challenges in the diagnosis. Diagnosis remains half the way towards managing the patient, especially in a critical care setting where timely decisions are very important. So this is a typical ECG that you want to see. No baseline drifts, a very clean, noiseless ECG that you have. Look at the P waves, the QRS and the T, there seems to be a 1:1 relationship between all of them. If you look at the precordial leads, there's a characteristic mid-cavity precordial transition suggestive of conduction through the intrinsic conduction system of the body into the ventricles. The P wave, when you see positive in lead 1, positive in AVF, suggesting a normal axis of the P wave, suggesting a sinus origin of the P wave itself. The QRS is also reasonably good without any evident abnormalities. The QT, when calculated, seems to be normal, and therefore this is what constitutes a normal ECG. Moving forward, the QT calculation is a very important part of our management of patients in the ICU or the CCU. The QT has to be calculated on the slope of the tangent to the horizontal, and because there are 12 leads and the variety of T waves can occur, this is a good guide to where to actually draw the tangent. If you have biphasic T waves, it's not necessary to go to the end of the T wave, but to draw the tangent to the maximal slope of the upward stroke of the T wave there. This ECG, as you can see, is one of the ECGs that we plan to discuss. Again, P waves do not seem to be very commonly seen or very easily seen. So there is some amount of sinus node dysfunction there. But if you look very closely, the QT here is very short. Common causes of short QT in an ICU setting is hypercalcemia. Again, in ICUs which deal with a lot of oncology patients, this is a very important diagnosis to keep in mind. Compare that with this ECG, where although you can see the P wave, there is a prolongation of the QT interval. Again, a very common finding in ICU settings. This is hypocalcemia. Other causes of QT prolongation should not be forgotten, especially drug-drug interactions. And we have to anticipate drug-drug interactions, especially when using drugs that have the potential to prolong the QT. Online resources may also be used, especially if we do not have a very good understanding with the newer drugs coming in. Every patient coming into the ICU should have a drug reconciliation, whereby interactions between drugs and especially those on the QT need to be evaluated. If you are giving drugs which have potential to prolong the QT, it may be good to avoid beta blockers and diuretics with the first dose of that drug, especially because bradycardia and dyselectrolytemia may cause challenges with this first dose. Again, shifting patients from amiodarone to a different drug, say sotalol, also has to be done carefully, and otherwise the QT may prolong in these patients. Going on from QT prolongation, sometimes we see these abnormal rhythms where it's not very easy to figure out what the QRS is. The precordial leads are a good idea to figure out where the QRS is. And if you look concentratedly on the precordial leads here, you can see that there are tall T waves along with a QRS that is reasonably wide. This should immediately tell us or make us suspicious of potassium abnormalities. Remember, potassium is the tent pole that keeps the T wave up. So very tall T waves, which are usually defined as with respect to the height or the depth amplitude of the QRS complex. If it's near equal, these are tall T waves suggestive of hyperkalemia. Remember, hyperkalemia changes can be across the atrial depolarization on the ECG as well as the ventricular and the repolarization segments. There is characteristically a PR segment prolongation, a widening of the QRS, bifid nature of the P wave, loss of the P wave, junctional rhythms, widening of the QRS again, and finally, what is a probable direct sine wave pattern with poor QRS depolarizations. These are reversible conditions, and when you are able to diagnose and manage them properly, can return the ECG back to pristine quality. Hyperkalemia also is a condition where the ECG changes do not correlate with that of the serum levels. So it's very important to have a high index of suspicion. Compare that to hypokalemia, where the tent pole for the T wave is lost. So there is a flattening of the T wave. There is an ST segment depression and prominent U waves are present. It almost causes a false QT interval prolongation because the T wave is so flat that we mistake the U wave for the T wave, and it's actually a QU interval rather than a QT interval. As I mentioned, the prevalence of ECG changes are not correlative of the serum abnormalities of potassium on the ECG. It is critical for us to actually draw up the potassium samples, ensure that it is not hemolyzed, and be able to detect hyper or hypokalemia. Important electrolyte, which is not very commonly seen on the ECG, but can contribute to abnormalities on the ECG, is hypomagnesemia. The changes are similar to potassium deficiency, where there is flattening of the T wave, ST segment depression, and prominent U waves. Another important drug, especially in the Indian scenario, is the use of digoxin. When digoxin is given for rate control in patients with atrial fibrillation, typically we can see what is the digoxin effect, well remembered by the mustache of Salvatore Dali, where the effect does not cross over the baseline. Digoxin itself can be contributory to a variety of arrhythmias, including a pseudo-normalization of the ventricular response in atrial fibrillation, atrioventricular blocks along with ventricular arrhythmias, sinus node dysfunctions, and the typical bidirectional ventricular tachycardias. It's important to assume and suspect patients having digoxin toxicity if a patient has been on digoxin previously, and sending a digoxin level may be therapeutic in these patients. This is another common arrhythmia which is seen when patients are in the ICU, especially in respiratory ICUs, on drugs like theophylline, where there may be a atrial fibrillation-like episode, but there are proper P waves seen, and when they have more than 3 morphologies, it's multifocal atrial tachycardia. It's usually slightly more elderly people, and most often because of the use of theophylline in patients with respiratory abnormalities. Other ECGs that can be commonly seen in patients within the ICU are the subtle changes on the ECG with near global ST segment elevation PR segment depression, suggestive of acute pericarditis. It's not an ST elevation myocardial infarction. And if you put a stethoscope on the chest, you will be able to hear the auscultatory rub. Commonly seen post-cardiac surgery, post-PVI, AFib ablation, or in patients who have myocardial infarctions, especially a large, massive LAD territory infarcts. Patient also complains of chest pain at this point, which confuses the diagnosis, but a look at the ECG is quite diagnostic in these patients. Another really bad looking ECG is this ECG where the heart is perfectly normal, but there is precordial T wave inversions, and the patient is probably having features of sluggishness, suggestive of raised intracranial tension, and probably a totally normal heart. Calling the cardiologist in at this point of time may not be of much value, whereas a neurologist may actually do a great deal of benefit to these patients. Now, coming to some obvious rhythm abnormalities, probably secondary to causes within the cardio-neural axis. This is sinus bradycardia. You can see every QRS, every P, QRS, and T wave coming 1:1. The axis of the P wave is quite normal, but the heart rate is quite slow. This is good old-fashioned sinus bradycardia, not usually a cause of worry unless there is a precipitating cause for the same. Sometimes there are pauses where the P wave is not seen. These are sinus pauses, and in the absence of any symptoms, should just be observed. This is quite an interesting ECG, suggestive of a very slow heart rate with a dropped P wave initially, followed by an increased heart rate and 1:1 conduction. This is typical of a vagal reaction, which can be seen when withdrawing sheaths or giving painful injections to these patients within the ICU. This is finally the pathologic ECG that you want to know with respect to bradycardic events in the ICU, where there is drop of more than one P wave along with a wide complex escape suggestive of a high-grade AV block. These patients diagnosed early need temporary pacing and further consequently a pacemaker. This is an ECG, which is a often very common arrhythmia. As with our algorithm, we cannot see proper P waves in these patients at all. Anything without any proper P wave and an irregular ventricular response should alert us to either ventricular fibrillation or atrial fibrillation. But given that the QRS is extremely pristine, this is atrial fibrillation. Sometimes atrial fibrillation has a rate which is properly normalized. The ventricular rate is regular, should alert us to the possibility of AV node disease. Either can be an acquired phenomenon post-cardiac surgery, or can be a presenting feature of a patient with digoxin toxicity or with sclerodegenerative AV nodal disease. This is another ECG. As you can see, that the ventricular rate seems to be faster than atrial rate. You hardly can see any P waves. This is a ventricular arrhythmia, but given that the QRS is extremely narrow, the origin of the arrhythmia seems to be within the conduction system, as justified by the mid-precordial transition of the QRS2. This is junctional rhythm, accelerated, and commonly seen post-cardiac surgery, especially with valve surgeries. This again needs observation. Ranolazine has been shown to be of very great use in patients, especially in the pediatric population, but without any hemodynamic abnormalities, does not really require any management. It slowly settles down and actually indicates some amount of damage or edema towards the AV node. Coming to these arrhythmias, these sets or grouped beating of beats are actually beats where the QRS morphology is not same to the intrinsic QRS morphology. You can hardly see any P waves here, more V than A, ventricular tachycardia, but these are non-sustained, lasting less than 30 seconds, and commonly seen in patients with ICU because patients are under a lot of stress, and that increases their sympathetic system outflow, thereby giving rise to outflow tract ventricular non-sustained VT. The diagnosis of outflow tract VT can be made with leads AVR and AVL, where the QS pattern of these abnormal ventricular beats are actually seen, suggestive of an outflow tract origin. Again, in the absence of hemodynamic compromise, these need not be evaluated or managed in an ICU setting. This, however, is a monomorphic ventricular tachycardia with a wide QRS complex. Causes of this in an ischemic setting could be reentrant ventricular tachycardia, but this can also be the consequence of proarrhythmic effects of some of the drugs used for the management of arrhythmias, particularly flecainide. This is important to know because these patients, if flecainide is on board, do not respond very well to cardioversion, and in fact, cardioversion may worsen the arrhythmia in these cases. So again, drug toxicity or reentrant arrhythmia secondary to ischemic substrate within the myocardium. Going on finally, from a monomorphic ventricular tachycardia to a polymorphic ventricular tachycardia. When you compare this ECG to the one before, you can see that there is no similarity between the various so-called QRS complexes across any of the leads. And if you look quite closely, you can see that in the ECG that is normal, you can see ST elevation. This is polymorphic VT. There is a predisposing factor in the form of ischemia, and these patients need urgent cardioversion and transfer to a cath lab for a primary PCI or other ways of management of their ischemia to be able to solve this problem. Going on from arrhythmias in the ICU to mechanisms of some commonly used antiarrhythmic drugs. Remember, the action potential within a normal ventricular cell consists of an initial resting phase or phase 4, an initial phase 0 modulated by sodium channels, then an initial dip or phase 1 modulated by ITO, which is essentially potassium channels, then a plateau where calcium channels mediate the plateau, followed by potassium channels down to complete the repolarization. Now, these are various channels that are seen on the cardiac membrane. In addition to all these channels, critical channels that are present on the sarcoplasmic reticulum, mainly the calcium channels, are also targets for a lot of our antiarrhythmic drugs. This is the typical antiarrhythmic drug classification that we know between classes 1 to 4, where class 1 is predominantly sodium channel blockers, class 2 are beta adrenergic antagonists, class 3 is potassium channel blockers, and class 4 are calcium channel blockers. This has undergone slight modifications where now, depending on the type of channel blocked, you are getting subdivisions into various channels. The sinus node sodium type channel, HCN type, is now blocked by a drug called ivabradine, which is placed in its own class by itself, class 0. However, the typical routine channels that are blocked by our sodium channel blockers include NAV type 1.5, where either binding in the open state of this particular channel or binding in the closed state of this channel actually determine which category of drugs we are using. If you bind in the open channel, it's your typical quinidine. When it binds in the closed state, it is mexalotine and lidocaine. And when it binds in the closed state with a slow dissociation, these are drugs like flecainide. Remember, these drugs, including flecainide, have a propensity to increase the width of the QRS because it is the sodium channel that contributes to the width of the action potential, and thereby the width of the QRS is a good estimate of whether or not these drugs have toxigenic potential.
Dr. Deepak, you have 2 minutes to summarize.
Sure, sir. Going on to class 1D, which is a newer drug with NAV type 1.5, where ranolazine is introduced. The commonly other used drugs include drugs like amiodarone, which act on the potassium channels in a non-selective manner, and drugs like dofetilide and ibutylide, which act on the IKR channel, which are selective, IK ultra rapids, which is vernaculant, and the ITO, which is tedisamil. It's very important to know these new drugs because additional applications are coming for these drugs, and it's critical to know where these drugs have understanding of what they do to the myocardium. The class 4 drugs are the calcium channel blockers. Depending on which calcium channel they block, they are divided into either selective or non-selective, as well as class 4B, which is flecainide. In summary, therefore, for management of arrhythmias in the ICU, we need to anticipate the changes in the rhythm. We need to have a knowledge of what can go wrong. You have to have a 12-lead ECG with a rhythm strip to diagnose what's the abnormality. Ruling out dyselectrolytemia as a cause for abnormal rhythm is a common denominator. Not all abnormal rhythms in the ICU need treatment. Masterly inactivity is a very important possibility in the ICU. And finally, action speaks louder than words in some emergencies in the ICU. Thank you everyone for a patient hearing.